Housing Opportunities Unlimited has been working with members of NHNRA for decades, and they've really developed a unique expertise in working with the resident population within the communities operated by our members. And a lot of people tell me that they're looking at deals they'd like to do, but they're daunted by the relocation aspects of the transactions, and they don't want to take that on. They don't know how to take that on. Well, Housing Opportunities Unlimited, with their deep expertise in this, really provides a very unique opportunity with a solution for managing this. So I will turn over to Chris to take it away.
We've been in business over 42 years. Originated right here in Boston over 40 years ago by Mr. David Connelly. And I'm going to let our panelists introduce themselves before we get started.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jaissa Feliz. I'm a development director with Beacon Communities. We are an owner, developer, and manager of mostly affordable housing. That's our bread and butter, but we also own and develop some mixed income and mixed use developments, mostly throughout the northeastern seaboard. We have 150 communities just about, and over 20,000 units in that geographic area, and my projects are focused in the Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York areas.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. TGIF. I'm Cathy Hoog. I'm an executive director for 2 public housing authorities on the North Shore of Massachusetts, Salem and Marblehead. We manage approximately a little over 1,000 units of public housing, and we have a large Section 8 voucher program as well as a number of different housing subsidy programs.
Hi, I'm Susan Connelly. I'm COO of HOU. I've been with Housing Opportunities for about 4 years. Prior to that, I was with the state working for Mass Housing Partnership, one of our quasi-public banks, doing community assistance work across the Commonwealth for 16 years. Prior to that, I worked for 2 developers, Bob Keene and Joe Corcoran, doing affordable and mixed income housing. And my first project was Harbor Point here in Boston, which was the conversion of Columbia Point into the first federal mixed income, and is really the blueprint for a lot of what you are all doing now.
Great, thank you, Susan.
Oh, Jamar. Geez, so Jamar's sick. He's not coming. So I talked to him this morning. He sends his apologies. I told him I'm going to cover his project so that he is sick at his own peril, because I will be answering questions. I've been working very closely with Jamar and Essence Development in New York City for over 2 years, and we'll talk about that community engagement process. The previous conversation was excellent and really kind of segues right into what we're talking about. But if you don't know Essence Development, I really, really recommend that you check out their website. They're an amazing, amazing group of people.
So we'll start this panel off actually with a quote from our previous session from Andrew, and he quoted, "The relocation process is very scary." And there are a lot of truths to that. And so the first question I want to pose to our panelists this morning are, what are some of the thoughts around the impact of relocation and the affected residents, and how you prepare and plan for the projects these 2 all are sought after? How does that work?
Sure, excellent question. It is a crucial part of these acquisition rehab projects in particular. I don't know if they're showing the project info up there. Yep, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how this worked at one of the projects that I worked with HOU on in Boston, Mass, Lenox Apartments. The relocation aspect really affects all parts of the redevelopment process: the design, the financing, the construction schedule. At Lenox, for example, we worked with HOU 3 years before closing and construction start. They were there for those early resident meetings pre-COVID, and leading up to the closing and construction start. just about a year in advance, HOU worked closely with us and the property management team and the residents to assess residents and household needs, which was key in this multi-dimensional Rubik's Cube that was a public housing redevelopment project, multi-phase acquisition rehab with 285 units across 12 residential buildings, and it was transitioning again from the public housing program to project-based Section 8 program through the HUD Demo Dispo program. And the Section 8 program had its own occupancy standards that differed from the public housing program, which then, of course, necessitated the relocation resident need assessment process that was even more important for this project in particular. The construction was phased, so we would vacate one building, we would renovate that building, we would have the residents from the subsequent building moving into that first building, similar to what Drew was mentioning earlier, really trying to prioritize those one-way moves to minimize disruptions for families as much as possible. And then we would move on to renovation of the next building, so on and so forth, until 2.5 years later, we got to the end of the site. And so, as you can imagine, coordination on relocation in a timely fashion was key to keeping construction on schedule and to minimizing the accrual of that construction loan interest on the financing side, which, for a project of this size was huge. So from that perspective, investing in a relocation consultant is really worth it. For the financial feasibility of the project, because the alternative could be hundreds of thousands of dollars of construction loan interest or downward timing adjusters on tax credit equity, things of that sort. So it really is crucial, a crucial aspect in all parts of the redevelopment planning process.
So in public-private partnerships, as many of you have experienced, a lot of the buildings that we're considering for redevelopment are occupied. And so when you think about the process of moving, how many of you in this room like that process? Anybody enjoy it? Probably very few, right? The process of moving is very stressful. And when you think about just one person, in all of the steps that you have to take to help one person move, the packing, the planning, the cleaning out, the cleaning up, all of the different things that you have to think about in terms of utilities and transitions and where you get your care. And then if you add additional factors into that, like physical disabilities or mental health related challenges, it's a lot. It's a lot for people. So the process is heavily influenced by, people's needs and concerns and worry. And the sooner that you can get a company involved like HOU, the better you're going to be in terms of evaluating people's needs, assessing, what's going to help them get through this process easier. And all of that, in turn, is going to affect your project in so many different ways. The timeline, the worry, the concern, when people are, fearful about something, there's tendencies for, misinformation to fly, and then that leads into another whole set of challenges that I'm sure we'll get into later on. But it's just an incredibly important service to consider as early as possible so that people have an opportunity to have their needs met early on, and the planning process can begin sooner rather than later.
Yeah, so we spoke about the interaction and the timing around that. And in our experience, we've had situations where we get a call and say, hey, we're doing this project. We'd like to engage you all. And our question is, of course, when would we like to do that? And they'd say, next week. And so obviously there's some challenges with that. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of engaging a consultant, almost as early as possible? One of the phrases that I like to use is early and often in terms of resident engagement and resident notification. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of that, along with some of the advantages of why that is so helpful in some of the projects?
Absolutely. I subscribe to your to your thoughts and your motto on that. As soon as possible, as often as possible, is definitely important for. I'll just continue to give the example of Lennox Apartments here. Huge multi-phase, multi-building redevelopment, occupied redevelopment project. As I mentioned. I don't know when the call first went out to you guys, because that was before my time at Beacon, but I can imagine that, I have fabulous colleagues that plan ahead, so I can imagine that that was years before I even came on board. But, as I mentioned, we brought HOU in even leading up to the permitting process. We started conducting those resident meetings over a year before we were starting our permitting process with the city. And, that lasted another 2 years. COVID hits, we have to shift gears, similar to what Sandra was describing earlier. Shift a lot of things online, shift, to phone communications, Zoom communications, written communications. And so having had that built-in time leading up to that allowed us to be able to pivot without losing that resident trust that we had developed over the years. After that process, then there is the household need assessment process, which is a survey, but one that residents want to respond to because they know that it has to do with how they're going to move, when they're going to move, where they're moving to, what the schedule is for that. For especially large projects, that takes a long time, and that then needs to also filter throughout, as I mentioned earlier, the various aspects of the redevelopment plan. Financing in particular, we needed to know what the ultimate unit mix would be so that we could determine what rents the property was going to be able to generate and what our HAP contract would look like and whether that would support the debt that would be needed to finance the redevelopment. And so that information flows through so many other aspects of the project. On the back end of that, we're talking with lenders and investors on that. And so, if those assumptions change, the entire structure of the financing changes. And so really doing that in a timely fashion to allow us to respond and adjust as needed is really important.
As an executive director for public housing authorities, we have a tremendous amount of modernization work, development work, redevelopment work that takes place over the course of any given year. And sometimes we don't have the luxury of engaging relocation specialists, and sometimes we do. And I have to say that in comparison, it makes all the difference in the world, okay? So, when you think about starting early, this gives the community, the developers, an opportunity to really kind of engage and understand what it is that people want, what their needs are. That assessment piece becomes incredibly important. It's also an opportunity to build trust, like our colleagues earlier spoke on. It's so incredibly important for the design process. Things can change drastically based on the feedback from the residents that live in the developments before the project begins. So that, all of the information that they share can really can drive the design and make changes accordingly. But, in talking about moving and the challenges related to moving, and the challenges related to, experiencing something really new and different and huge, that generates a lot of fear for people, right? Sometimes anger, sometimes people, out of anger and fear, will talk a lot about details of the project that may not necessarily be accurate, and those details spread quickly, right? The rumor mill happens, and then before you know it, you have more people that are a little bit angry or misinformed. And when this type of dynamic is in play for a development project, it can really impact timing, and time is money, right? So when you've got a relocation company involved early, you just have this opportunity, this really great opportunity to make sure that the information is shared and it's accurate. And you can, have meetings where the information is, consistently shared in the same way, and people's fears are lessened as a result. So, we've all experienced those projects where, out of fear, out of anger, people make phone calls, right? And they start calling their government officials, and they start calling somebody else, and then somebody calls somebody else, and the next thing you know, you're at a permitting hearing, and there's all sorts of angry people and misinformation. That's part of the process. It's par for the course, but I think that getting a relocation company in early and really working closely with people, ensuring that they understand all the details of the project, that they understand what the needs are, can really help kind of squelch some of that negativity and that misinformation, which can make a huge impact on the project in the end.
And I'll talk a little bit about our experience in New York. So we are currently working on 7 RAD Section 18 deals in New York with different developers as part of NYCHA's, New York City Housing Authority's PACT program. And PACT is kind of an overarching philosophy and approach for community engagement and further ensures resident rights. And this came out of a pretty famous locally failed HOPE 6, where people were displaced, and nobody knows where half those people landed. People were not properly case managed. And so when I first met with Jamar probably 3 years ago, part of the conversation was residents don't trust NYCHA. And I remember going to the site and going to some apartments, and I thought, why would they? I mean, it was some of the worst housing conditions I have ever seen in the United States of America in my entire life. And I've been doing this work for 40 years. I could not believe, we saw people who had buckets with a sawhorse with a plank as their kitchen counter and a raw pipe coming out of a wall as their sink. And molds that you could not even imagine. Like, it was just so mind-blowing. And here I am walking through this site with a developer who's saying, we have to do something now. If we get selected, we need to have a presence immediately. So we've been on that site for 2 years doing resident engagement. We're only now doing the relocation plan because it's taken 2 years for us and a team of 8 people, and this is obviously a huge investment, but it was part of the plan because Jamar understood they were not going to get through any kind of public process if they didn't have trust. And so that trust came from us taking on, and this is not unusual, we do this with the Boston Housing Authority, with other housing authorities. Part of our engagement became advocacy work. So developers have to be comfortable with us being advocates for residents, to you, and to the housing authority. And so that's part of the work we do. And so we started working with residents on rent arrearages, right? Which sounds like so simple, but if you're a housing authority starving for money, you're negotiating with a developer that you just assume has deep pockets, and part of your payment as a housing authority is to get the arrearages, which for this project with 2,000 plus units is millions and millions of dollars. You don't want somebody working with residents to figure out how the arrearages came about, if they're actually accurate. Not always. What happened during COVID, that they couldn't let people know they had lost their job because the offices weren't open. That's the kind of like deep dive that we're doing with almost every single household. Our team, as a whole, our team nationally speaks 14 languages. Our goal in a community like Fulton, Elliott, Chelsea is to hold community engagement in the primary languages spoken, not to do translation. It's disrespectful, right? If 40% of your population is Spanish speaking, why aren't we doing things in Spanish as a primary role? So that's the kind of things that we bring. And then we're taking pictures, we're going to NYCHA meetings, we're saying this person needs to move, this person needs this. And NYCHA was so, is anyone here from NYCHA? I should ask that. It's okay, because they're used to me now. NYCHA was so uncomfortable. They were so uncomfortable. And Sandra was saying about changes, right? So we had a New York City administration change. We're still going through some changes in New York City. We went from Greg Russ, Public Housing Authority Director Extraordinaire, who I had worked with as a commissioner on the Cambridge Housing Authority, like all this stuff, and then it just all shifted, right? And so, and then now the developer's trying to figure out gaps and all of that kind of stuff, right? So even though there's so many similarities in these projects, the uniqueness of each one has to be taken into account. You can't approach it all just, as something like the Lenox deal that we did. We had 3 shootings at Lenox, one of them in the middle of the day in front of our office where the young man died. And people in our office knew him because we hire a lot of people from the community. So we are managing, and we became solace for the community, right? Like, so it's not, relocation is, the easy part is the moving. It's all the other pieces that we bring to it so that developers do meet their timeline, so they're not delayed. And residents trust that if we tell them they're coming back, that they're coming back. We have relocated over, what number are we at now?
Close to 70,000.
Close to 70,000 households. And I think we've, just in this past 4 years, we've had one where we had to work with the developer to get a legal process involved. That reflects our approach. That really reflects our approach. So for New York, that has been a totally, we're not even doing relocation yet. Like, we are doing all the build up to it. And again, I think the great question around earlier about burnout on questionnaires. We combine, I was saying to Karen before we started, I had said to Jamar, you need to use co-urbanize. And he took a pass. He regrets that. You can quote me even though he's not here. He definitely, because you need that level platform and you need people on the ground that keep that communication going, right? And have to have a presence. But we also work with developers who understand our role and don't just say, where's the relocation plan? They're asking us, how are residents feeling about this? And that's the difference.
Thank you, Sue. You spoke about a plethora of challenges, and I want to ask and pose a question about the ultimate challenge. What are your experiences around residents who absolutely refuse to relocate? This is not a trick question.
How much time do we have?
Right. Where to even begin? I mean, the trust and the lack of trust and the fear is real. So I would say that in the beginning of the process, especially in public housing redevelopments, right, where they're going from a publicly owned and managed development to a public-private partnership, but they see it as the big bad, private developer coming in to raise rents and displace people. There's pushback, and there are people that will vehemently, decide in the beginning that, no, I'm not moving, and they will tell everyone that will hear them that that's their stance. And over the course of all that time that we need to put in engaging residents and working with HOU to understand their concerns, that minimizes. And I have also only seen one case where there was a legal situation, and that didn't even have to do with refusal to relocate as much as it had to do with lease violations. And so all of that just goes to show kind of what are the practical results of the early and often relocation and resident engagement involvement process, aside from avoiding delays and the money, the costs associated with those delays. It's the number of people that go from, I will not move, to, okay, I will cooperate because you've explained to me, I trust, you've worked with me on my needs. And so that's what we do. It's just everything that we've been talking about is engaging in addressing needs from early on to avoid that. I've only seen one case, and it didn't have to do with relocation.
So for our project in Salem, we had a number of different challenges within our community, in the development itself, and in the city, in the surrounding city, with regard to abutters and different challenges related to the project. Like Sue was saying earlier, having the team on site, accessible and available to people day in and day out. We actually utilized a vacant unit as an office for HOU, and they had office hours that were widely known and distributed. Residents got really familiar and comfortable with going to see them, to chat about, what's the latest and greatest. This is what I heard from my neighbor. Is this true? Somebody's on Facebook saying this. Is that true? And we did have a number of residents that were, really afraid, angry, and I often say that anger is a secondary emotion to fear. I think that a lot of this is about just being fearful of the unknown. For a lot of folks, they've really only moved one or two times, or perhaps more than that, and their experience wasn't necessarily a pleasant one. So, again, that anger can also represent previous trauma for people. So having the relocation team available and present on site made a huge difference for us. We were able to take those challenging opportunities and actually view them as an opportunity to really help people understand, exactly what was happening with the project and why, and the timeline, and working closely with needs and identifying what the specific fears were and how we could work together to try to resolve those. So ultimately, everybody did end up relocating. We had a few really tough situations, but they were viewed as opportunities with our team. We worked together and came up with solutions that, in the end, really helped people with the transition.
And I would just add to that that a couple of things I think happen also. One is if you have people who are under, or the housing authority that you're working with, or whatever the situation is, that are under some kind of lease violation, they actually legally have to get a different set of relocation documents. They're not getting the same set, and they have to be tracked differently. And so what we bring is a separateness that allows everybody else to do their jobs versus your boss saying, hey, relocation's too expensive, you figure out on the team how it's going to get handled. That is just not realistic. This is the most time you know, the biggest lift in terms of time and effort in hand-holding individuals and supporting their unique situations. Every site we go to, we have a separate phone number and a separate website. And we filter all the relocation issues, and then we put those in reports. If something's really management, because my toilet's not working, we let them know who to call. And we have a dial system that rolls. So if we have 4 people on the site, the first person identified gets that call. If they're not available, it rolls to the next person. Our goal is to have the majority of calls answered by a live person the first time. And we also, we're not just 9 to 5, right? We're working weekends, we're working after hours. We work when the community needs us to work. So it's that kind of flexibility that often can't be accommodated by the development team that we provide.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'd like to open up the floor for questions for the panelists.
Either you're all asleep or we're so good that we just, yeah. Thank you, Margaret, we're that good, yeah. Nothing?
Well, if there are, oh, we do have some. Oh,
One.
Go, Patricia.
hey.
Question about getting residents to move. You know, you talked about how you're able to get them to move. What about the people that you've had, talk a little bit about when you're not convincing them, but maybe having to pay them or give them other services or whatever it is that, for that holdout. What are the ways that you've thought about whether they, what they got and how that felt fair to the other people who had already moved?
We won't do that. And I just mean that, like, we have developers all the time at the end who say, oh, we'll give a $25 gift card to Star Market. I'm like, yeah, no. Or whatever, you know, I mean, we work with a developer that just wants to pay everyone to leave. No. Like, I don't think we've ever, have we done that? I don't remember doing that, no. I mean, we're pretty clear with our clients that we won't do that. It sets up a, so we identify people early on. Like, there's 2,200 units in Fulton, Elliott, and Chelsea. We've already surveyed 75% of them. We've talked to the maintenance teams, to the tenant leaders, to other residents. We've identified people that we know are going to be problematic, and we're working with them now, even though they don't have to move for another 2 years. And what we're going to do with some of them, and we have done this in the past, is we move them out of order. So we're going to say, hey, there's a moment of opportunity here with Sue Connelly, and so we need to do a one-way move. She's scheduled for a two-way move within the construction and relocation plan. That's not going to work. We have to limit the impact. So we're going to take her and we're going to move her, even though she's in phase 4, we're going to move her into phase 1. You know, we've been doing Old Colony with Beacon for 10 years with multi-phases, different financing packages, and we've definitely had to do that, move people out of phase, out of order to meet those needs. And that's why it's so important that we're there early and often.
Yeah,
I
and
was just going to say that, sorry. That's that piece about getting started earlier rather than later. Whoever you're working with for a housing authority, we generally have an idea of who may be challenging for whatever reasons, because we have an experience, working with the residents, prior to the project. So identifying those folks early on and really taking that opportunity to work together with HOU to identify what their specific needs are, why they're going to be a challenge. It's not just, they're difficult or they're, mean, nasty people. There's usually reasons behind it. So, what are the challenges about? Is it that they're afraid they're not going to be close enough to their medical providers or their family, and taking, the opportunity to act when something does become available that's going to be sufficient for them. And you wouldn't know that unless you got started early on and you were really taking the time to engage with people and figure out what their needs were. You'd be more likely to be able to identify a spot for them.
Beacon has an internal design company called Beacon Concepts that works on interior design, and something that we do as part of the resident engagement and relocation process that also motivates people to want to move out is model units. And we will show them finishes, and we will show them what it's going to look, this is what you're going to get after you move. That often motivates people too, especially, Sue mentioned, some of the tough conditions that folks are in at the moment that you're talking to them. And so kind of having a visual in front of you of what am I getting after this process? What is the benefit to me? It motivates people.
Thank you, Susan, for identifying me here. It's a follow-up to your comment. I just want to make sure I was clear on what you were saying. So with the problem individual that you were describing in the hypothetical or perhaps real scenario, you would be moving them into the new development once complete, as opposed to a temporary home, then the new development, to reduce the amount of displacement that they're going through.
It depends on the development. I mean, sometimes I think people going up 140 Clarendon tour. We did the relocation of that. We started that during COVID. We were the only people on the site, right? There was no management, nobody was there except for us. We were considered a whatever the term was yes, with the construction folks, because they can't do their job unless we're there and working very closely with them. That's a whole other session on how to do that well. And so we are often having to relocate people into temporary homes and this is, I'm glad you asked that question for clarification, because this is a good example where we did have some challenges. There were 70 existing people living at 140 Clarendon, the majority of whom had experienced being homeless at some point in their adult or late teens. And so we were managing a lot of mental health issues. So when we met with Darcy Jemison, the project manager, and Howard Cohen, the primary person at Beacon, about how to manage this, and we have a long history with them, we made a decision together to bring because Beacon has their own social services, to bring their team on as part of the relocation process, because we knew that was going to be a challenge. And so they had team members who are still working there as part of the services provided, but they were part of our relocation team, saved Beacon money on their relocation budget, and got them involved early. And we were able to really get deep, intensive resources and support for people. Everyone in that building had to move at least twice, if not 3 times, because they had to rotate around the building as construction rotated. And so it was incredibly disruptive and difficult. And there was we didn't have an off-site option for those folks. So again, it's very specific, and that's actually, that was exactly why we did what we did. So thank you for the question.
Okay, well, thank you for a informative session on a topic that's very daunting and leads to a lot of people not doing deals. Hopefully you'll encourage them to take a look at deals that do include relocation.
And Peter, if I can just remind people, URA regs changed and went into effect June 3rd. And there's some major changes that affected temporary relocation. So I just want to give developers in the room a heads up to be aware of that. If you're not using HOU, that you are aware of that. Otherwise, we'd let you know.
So,
Thanks, Peter.
thank you, everybody.